Welcome to the replay from our virtual Green Drinks July 2022 Tales from the Storm. We welcomed Art Hunter, David Long, Michael Banks, and Dr. Alexandra Mallet to speak about lessons in community resilience. Enjoy this replay.
All right, welcome everybody to Virtual Green Drinks July. And for those of you who don't know me, I am Nick Hebb with SmartNet Alliance. And the Alliance is a group of businesses and organizations who are working on projects and initiatives to accelerate Canada's transition to a sustainable economy. And we know folks are very laser focused on the environment, but we do have to also bring the economy along with us. And that's what we're trying to do here at SmartNet Alliance. For more information on SmartNet, please consult our website. I'll put that into chat shortly. And be sure to check out our membership page if you're looking to get into to any retrofits, renovations, tons of different stuff on there from all our members who are doing amazing work out there. So tonight we'll feature Tales from the Storm, Lessons in Community Resilience. And I think we can all remember where we were this past May 21st when an unprecedented storm blew through our region. Many of us lost power for days and some for weeks. Lineups at gas stations and grocery stores were the norm. And sadly, several people did lose their lives. One silver lining from the storm: several Ottawa homeowners were able to power their homes and their communities using renewable technologies. And many people's eyes were open to the need to create more grid independence. Tonight, we will feature some of those resilient few. We will hear from Dr. Art Hunter, scientist and microgrid homeowner. We'll also hear from David Long, IT specialist, and Mike Banks, vice president over at the Electric Vehicle Council of Ottawa. We've got time for Q&A after their presentations. And following those, we've got a very special talk from Dr. Alexandra Mallet, who is the Associate Professor of Sustainable Energy Program over at Carleton University. So that should be a great one. She'll give us an overview on what's going on at the grid, grid independence in Canada and internationally. So let's welcome up our first speaker. Dr. Art Hunter is a graduate from the Royal Military College and National Defence College. He held spacecraft design positions with Telestat Canada, the Communication Technology Satellite Project, and was the project manager for the Canada Arm for Space Shuttle Project at the National Research Council of Canada. He has over 30 years of broad experience and knowledge on many technical disciplines. Art is also on the board of directors of the Canadian Association for the Club of Rome. And more importantly, he owns and has constructed his own microgrid home in the Manotick area, which was recently helped his community weather the aftermath of the vicious storm that tore through Ottawa in May. So welcome in, Art. You should be able to unmute yourself and fire up your presentation. I know we have a bit of a short video that I'll share as well, but we'll let you get started. And yeah, fascinated to hear your story. I know you were sort of thrust into the media spotlight as well, and you were able to help out countless folks during the storm. So come on in there, Art. Thanks again for joining us.
Okay, what I'm going to do is just break this into three parts. One is, of course, defining what a microgrid is. Not a lot of people really know what that means, and in my case, the microgrid that I own and have run for 5 years is fossil fuel free. I'm going to talk a little bit about the future and what is the role of microgrids coming up in the future. I won't spend a lot of time on that, but it should let you know that there is a lot of activity happening with the IESO. And then I have a short video which the CBC wanted to make, and there's some good information in there that at least the CBC wanted, and I presume you folks would be interested in that too. This is my house. I'm one unit in a quadplex. So you can see I have solar on my west roof, and this is the south-facing roof, and of course some solar over the garage as well. Now, I want to take a look at it from another angle because there's other elements here. There's two EVs, and the EVs are an integral part of the microgrid. They're not just vehicles for getting around. And of course, on the wall here is one of the early prototypes from Roco Industries, which he'll be replacing soon for a vertical wall solar. This is in my garage, and it shows about half the black boxes which I've got along the wall. The thing that's interesting for this presentation is really these 4 plugs right here. Each one of those is a 15 amp plug. And when I'm saying I was plugging in 4 homes, one was going in each one of these. You can see here, here's a level 2 charger, and here's a level 1 charger for the Tesla with the connector hanging over the end here. Here's what that yard looked like when I was putting in the ground source heat pump and using what is known as a SVEC coil. And that's a heat exchanger that went in the ground, about 8 feet deep. And that was put it in and it was backfilled with sand and then topped up with laid clay again. The soil's kind of interesting. As you can see, the walls are near vertical. It hasn't all collapsed in, and one can make use of that characteristic in a ground source heat pump. Here is what the geothermal wall looks like. And because I have 2 of those coils, there's 2 pair of penetrations going through the foundation and a whole network of interesting plumbing. Now, everybody, of course, doesn't have to do this. You see, I insisted on making this a research instrument. Therefore, it's got a number of these boxes, which are ball valves, which allows me lots of opportunity to switch things around. This is not my hot water tank. It's a hot water tank which I use as a means to add heat into the fluid that is flowing through this array of plumbing, and hence I can store energy in the ground. And this is just a pressure vessel. This is the control room, I call it, and these are the 3 Tesla batteries, and they're lined up like a deck of cards, and you know, just some old computers and switches and monitors and what have you. And for those who like block diagrams, there is, of course, a number of demands which are made from lighting, cooking, EVs, space heating, water heating. And we've got storage, you know, Tesla batteries, and I store energy in the ground, sources and sinks, solar, grid, heaters, geothermal. And what's of importance here is that 82% of the energy used in the average Canadian home is thermal. Therefore, one should pay 82% of your attention and your investments on thermal, and it's only 18% electric. Most people look primarily at electric, and well, that might be of interest to some, but look at heating and cooling. This is a slide which I've taken from a presentation that I'm through the KCOR Zoom series, and it of course follows up behind Raymond Lurie, who spoke on EVs and using their batteries to store electricity. Of course, the core issue that we're looking at in energy transition on our electricity grid is how do we integrate renewable power, both generation and storage, into the Ontario electricity grid, because we're seeking robustness, decarbonization, decentralization, demand growth, cost reduction, and disaster management. Now, people really start to understand what that means, having been through a disaster. And there will be more. Now, we need to control our own energy supply and make it safe and domestic and close. Using decentralized microgrids to electrify everything, it's an obvious pathway, and that's the pathway we're going down. Just wanted to show a little bit of performance of what happens on my microgrid. And this is in kilowatt hours over a 24-hour period. This is midnight to midnight. Clearly that's sunrise and that's sunset. And you can see this is solar generation, and it's not really nice and clean. Clouds are going by, and so the power that's generated is never perfect. Whereas the demand side is really quite a different curve. There's a base level here of about 500 watts, and then there are 4 spikes here that are in fact times when I'm heating hot water. But do note that they're totally different shapes. They don't correlate at all, and they're each independent of each other. So the control system clearly has to bridge the gap. And but if you look at the actual numbers that were generated over that 24-hour period, means that there was an excess produced. And of course, if you took 150s of these systems, that would be equivalent to a small modular reactor, nuclear reactor that has 3 megawatts output. So communities of 150 of these guys could start removing the need for all those power lines. Now, microgrids and DER, these are distributed energy resources, are an essential part of course, modernizing our grid across the province. And there are pilot projects going on right now. One big one is in Ottawa, and they're looking at how to set up a business model and where everyone wins. And this is expected to trigger great interest from governments and the private sector. And that includes both buildings as well as transportation, where you have two-way participation in the power grid. Cities and local distribution companies will have new command and control responsibilities. Of course, when you take a look at aggregations, one can end up with saying, well, can I include all electric vehicles, all those with 2, 3, 4 and more tires? Well, yeah. And communities into virtual power plants. And that means if you, the studies have shown that in Ontario, we should be able to get between 5 gigawatts and 26 gigawatts produced from people with solar on their roof. And of course, that would mean the equivalent of 87 small modular reactors that are producing 300 megawatts, or a massive number of 8,700 at the smaller 3 megawatt. You can sure see these scattered all over the province. And so some studies consider the number of microgrids required to prevent building distant nuclear hydrothermal plants, and particularly as the drive to electrify everything starts driving the demand. And of course, there are times when there is an intentional shutting down due to wildfires, as in California, and I see that Texas is actually doing that now because of the excess heat dome that they're under, and it's probably happening as we're talking. And of course, they've had problems with cold weather, etc. And of course, our friend Elton, I read Mosketeer recently. He's working with Texas and California regulators to build out several virtual power plants. And he wants to go off and verify that this is a good way to go, and he wants to get into that business. Some of the things I've just said, of course, are available from the IESO, the Independent Electricity System Operator, who are the folks in charge of delivery of power to all of the consumers in the province. And this, by the way, just came out in June the 22nd. So at this time, I was going to ask Nick if he can start up that video from the CBC, and I presume you're going to. I'll stop the share. You can pick out where you want to start and where you want to stop.
Yeah, perfect, Art. I've got a nice little clip there from your for your things. There's some great videos there as well. So let me get that playing, and then we'll come back. We'll have a good chance for a nice Q&A session. So if you do have any questions for Art, anything comes up through the video, please add them into chat, and we will get rolling on the Q&A as soon as this video is done. But it's a great video. It's nice to see some actual footage of that as well. So let me get that rolling right now for everybody.
All over the region, there are stories of hardship, but also neighbors going out of their way to help others. When the power went out in Manitic, one resident still had a good supply, thanks to his solar panels and microgrid. Art Hunter has been powering all kinds of things for his neighbors. I spoke to him earlier this week, and here's part of our conversation. Art Hunter, thanks so much for joining us.
I'm glad to be here.
Art, the Manitic area, like many areas across the region, lost power. And yet you managed to keep the lights on. How did you do it, Art?
I have what is known as a microgrid, which produces all its own power. I have solar on the roof, I have batteries in my basement, and I can get all my heat from the ground. So and I also have 2 electric vehicles. So I'm totally fossil fuel free and energy independent. I do not need the grid to survive.
So you've been on this for quite some time. How did you start? And what was the motivation?
Well, I started doing the design and thinking about it about 7 years ago. I was motivated primarily by the environmental concerns. I wanted to get off fossil fuels and to get to the point where I've electrified everything. So my lifestyle would be all electric. And after 2 years of pondering and thinking of the options, I started installing components, started with the solar, of course, first. And over a period of about 1.5 years, I ended up putting in the entire system. And since then, I've been going for 5 years and sort of tweaking things around the edges and figuring out what I've got.
And in layperson's terms, how does it all work? Can you kind of give us the Coles Notes version? Just summarizing how it operates?
Okay, the solar arrays, as everyone knows, generates electricity. That electricity is provided into the house through your circuit breaker panel, such that it provides all the circuits in the house. If in fact there is more solar energy than you're consuming, that extra energy goes off and charges the battery. And if the battery then gets full, that extra energy is then dumped onto the grid, and the grid provides what are known as credits, which means that when the sun does go down, that you can start drawing on your credits and you get them back to you for free. Mm-hmm. So that's it's sort of like using the grid as a battery itself.
Now, you are a highly trained rocket scientist. You actually worked on the Canadarm. Does one need to be a rocket scientist to put a microgrid like this together?
I was the project manager on Canadarm, and one does not have to do that. It's just that I needed to, in fact, build this system and convert my house into a lab ever since I got retired, and to fiddle with it and set it up as a demonstrator, because most people really don't understand what it is, how it all works. And so what I was doing was having regular tours, and I ended up having 131 of them so far before the pandemic hit, and just to show people how it can be done. And in the process, of course, I've managed to convince a number of people to go off and do at least part of what I have done. And that's very gratifying. People are actually trying to become energy independent.
Now, speaking of convincing, on Saturday, of course, the storm hit your neighborhood, the community lost power, your lights were still on, and then you put the call out. You encouraged your neighbors to come by and plug in. Tell us what happened.
Well, that's interesting. Well, my neighbors had always regarded me as some sort of strange scientist that lived down at the end of the road there, and nobody really knew what he was doing. But look at all the solar on his house, and why in the world anybody do that when, you know, we got power that comes in from Hydro One. I mean, it just doesn't make sense. But when the grid goes out, about half hour after the grid went out, one of the neighbors came along and said, "Can I charge my cell phone?" And that was the start. And I said, "Of course, I've already made some provisions here in my garage for this sort of thing." And very shortly after that, another neighbor came along and said, "I'm very concerned about the food in my freezer. Can we run a cable across the road, and so I can plug in my freezer and possibly my refrigerator?" And I said, "We certainly can do that." And so we set up a cable to do that. And in the process, other neighbors saw us doing this. And I ended up connecting 4 of these living units into my system, primarily to run their freezer. And they in turn were talking to other neighbors, and people were filling up their freezers, so they weren't losing food. And I had one fellow who was very stressed out about his sump pump, and got him connected up, and he felt very comfortable after that. So everybody has a different motivation. Oh, by the way, and there was a constant need for power to cell phones. I even had one woman come around and she brought a kettle full of water and plugged it in my garage, got it boiling, and took it home to make tea. Yeah. I had another neighbor come around and say, "I haven't had a shower for 2 days. Could I have a shower?" So, yep.
So Art, you become a very popular person in Manitoba. You could probably run for mayor or city council or something by now.
Well, I get 4 votes. Yes.
What does it mean to you to be able to kind of help out in this emergency situation?
Very satisfying. Come now, you know, the point is that I live in a neighborhood, and I have no way of facing my neighbors by saying, "No, I'm not going to share this with you." When in fact, I know full well I have excess. I mean, really, this doesn't make sense. And if I can help people relieve their stress, I will do that. And I found it interesting as well that the feedback at the conclusion of this emergency, at least locally with my neighbors, that they're now starting to plan and prepare for the next one. And that to me is very satisfying, because there's going to be more. We know that. And the only thing that's open to debate is when and for how long.
Do you think you're going to spark a bit of an energy independence revolution in Manotick?
I hope so. I would really, really like that. Yes.
Yeah. Any tips, Art, for the rest of us who maybe aren't as well prepared as you are? What should we be doing to prepare for the next emergency?
Well, there you go. I plan to survive. I belong to the Canadian Association for the Club of Rome, and we wrote a document called Plan to Survive. That's about 4 years old now, and I'd be more than happy to share that with whoever wants it.
Well, this has been quite. It's been quite the 4 or 5 days for you. Are you kind of being kept up at night all the time? Like, I would imagine with all these plugs, there must be a fair bit of noise in the house.
Well, I mean, it's a power bar with 4 cables coming out of it. Doesn't make a whole bunch of noise, okay. and the power is in fact coming from the batteries, and the batteries are very quiet. So it's not a noisy thing at all. In fact, there's no noise. Electrons flow and they don't make noise.
All right, great video. Thanks so much for sharing that, Art, and I was glad to be able to play it for everybody. Some great footage there, and yeah, no, great to see what you're doing on the ground there. Let's take a look at some of the questions. And what I got from your presentation also is that we only need another 149 arts to create as much power as a nuclear plant. So we can get working on that. Folks, feel free to add into chat there your questions. I had, first off, Dan was wondering, who was the contractor that installed the ground source heat pump well and system for you, Art?
Okay, that was Martin Air, and they're out of Carp. And when I first started talking to him, he took everything I had to say in stride, which I found really abnormal. He's a very capable fellow, and I would recommend him to anyone considering a ground source heat pump. Yeah,
it looked like Jeff used him too. Thanks for mentioning that, Jeff. So definitely some good thumbs up there. Maybe we'll have to reach out and get him as a SmartNet Alliance member as well. So I had another question from David Wilson. He's just wondering what that Ottawa project that you mentioned. It was he was wondering if you could just talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, it's being headed up by Ottawa Hydro, and they're in fact using the expertise from Blue Wave AI, which is an AI company with a bunch of wizards there that have been looking at this sort of thing for quite a number of years, and ultimately they're looking at how, in fact, a bunch of microgrids, including electric vehicles, can be integrated into the grid in a way where, as I've said, it's a win-win-win situation where the grid owner costs go down, where the owner of the EV and other microgrid assets gets remunerated for offering up or at least leasing off the hardware, and of course the big winner will be the end user, and that's all of you. Where studies have shown that potentially the cost of electricity delivered to your meter can go down from between 50% to 85% down, which is real interesting. It means we don't have to pay for all that those massive towers and infrastructure and Darlington and all those nuclear facilities. Not necessary.
Yeah, no, that's an important message there. Alistair was wondering, would you stick with Tesla? Assume on the batteries over the car, but yeah, would you stick with Tesla on the
Oh,
batteries?
well, I'm used to them. I have not evaluated all the competition out there, and I sure know that there's a lot coming, and some that are out there now. And face it, the Tesla batteries I have are 5 years old, and in the world of batteries, that's pretty ancient. But one of the things which I particularly like is the software, and they keep it updated, of course, along with the software for the EVs. And this is very powerful software. They got some very capable folks that are putting this stuff together, and it meets all the needs that I have. So yes, I like my power walls. And I'm kind of wondering when they're going to come out with version 3, but however, right now they're very popular.
Yeah, yeah, it kind of adds to the credo that they're not really a car company or a battery company, they're a data company, right? So
Exactly.
interesting there. Rosalind's wondering, would you expand your grid operations? Could we get maybe a few different Art Hunter microgrid homes around the block? Are you thinking about expanding anything?
Well, the thing is, I have worked with many people to date, and who many of them have gone off and have put solar on their roofs, and they're putting batteries in and have converted to EVs and what have you. And when I do that, I know nobody wants to do it all in one go, so I try and make sure that they are planning for future upgrades and adding things on. And over the years, that's happened. People, are phasing things in. So the story isn't done. The story is just starting.
Yeah, absolutely. I know when we're advertising renewable technologies and getting folks to do retrofits and heat pumps and working with the Electric Vehicle Council and more folks are getting into EVs, it's definitely a gratifying feeling. Richard had a few different questions here. His first was, how are you able to install geothermal in a residential area? He called to ask, but they said other underground items would freeze. So is there a particular like freezing point you need to be at, or what would you need to look at for that?
Okay, well, I went to the National Building Code, and I suggest that anybody interested should do the same thing, just to see what the building requirements were, rather than letting someone tell me what they are. I like to find out and know in advance. And most of the time, the people that are telling you things really don't know what they're talking about. I don't know where they're getting their data, but it isn't from a qualified source. And you don't freeze the ground, you're taking energy out. The ground is never frozen around my heat exchangers that I've got in the ground. So I don't know where this nonsense comes that you're going to freeze anything that's underground. That's just
Yeah,
not.
sometimes we're battling misinformation out there too, right? Richard was also wondering, do you have any water management or recycling systems? You mentioned your neighbor with a sub pump, but how about yourself?
Um, well, in my case, there's 4 of us, or 4 living units under one roof, as it were, and in a small condo corp, and we share a well, and we share our own septic system. So what I do is I put those guys on my microgrid when there is a power outage. So yeah, the toilet's still flush, and people can get water.
And he's wondering, why stay connected to the grid at all when you have your batteries? Why not just rip up that Hydro Ottawa bill or Hydro One bill?
Well, there's 2 very good reasons. One is because I have excess power, I sell power to Hydro One. Now, why would I tear the wires out when they're sending me, $400 and $500 a month? I'm quite happy to stay connected. And the other reality is that there are times, particularly in the winter, where there's snow all over the arrays. It's bleak and miserable out, and I have no option. I have to draw power from the grid. So because my batteries are flat and I've got nothing left. So that just doesn't make sense. Just as redundancy alone would demand that.
Yeah, absolutely. So are you able to choose if your power goes into the grid or the batteries, or does it automatically get the battery up to a certain point and then go to the grid? How does that all work?
Okay, what happens is solar comes in. The first thing it does, it tries to address the load in the house, you know, your lights, appliances, computers, etc. And the next thing it does, once that's satisfied and there's some power left over, it goes and checks the battery and charges the batteries until such time as they're full. Then it says, where can I go next? And then it goes and it starts dumping excess energy onto the grid. And that's where I get credits back. And so right now, this time of year, I'm generating lots of credits, and I'll be using those in the winter.
No, that's great. Why not make some money for you, right? So that's interesting. So for those folks who think, hey, I just want to go solar and I'm going to be grid independent, well, you need to add the battery, and don't forget that. Brent's wondering the estimated cost of a geothermal installation. I know you did yours years ago, but a rough idea of what that cost? Obviously, probably be a bit more today.
Well, I think I get asked this question all the time. First off, I put in a microgrid that is really a lab. It's a laboratory. I have done things in my geothermal which nobody would do. You saw all the plumbing and everything else, and extra and additional things which I've added, which is one reason I like Barton Air, because I told him what I wanted to do, and he took it in his stride without falling off his chair. And so and he stayed with me the whole way and put in this far more complex system than other people would. And so my cost was obviously higher than your cost, because you wouldn't do all that. But I can tell you, I spent about 30 grand on the ground source heat pump.
Yeah, I think 15, 20,000 is kind of some of the stuff that I heard as a ballpark for folks that are thinking about it. Rick's wondering, how much are you paid for your power? I know you touched on it a little bit, obviously a bit more in the summer. And what happens if the grid does not need your power? I assume that doesn't ever happen, right?
No, the grid always needs the power. And what I got in on the Microfit program before they closed it down, and I'm getting paid 30 cents per kilowatt hour.
Awesome. Well, that's great. Yeah, so we'll let everybody do the calculations at home. I've got one more question from Jeff, and keep in mind we've got Mike who's going to talk later about the vehicle to load, but Jeff was wondering, were you able to get power out of your Tesla back into your microgrid? Maybe you have an older Tesla that doesn't do that. Were you able to try that, or does yours have that functionality?
No, to get two-way flow out of the Tesla, you've got to have necessary electronics in the charger, and you got to have the necessary electronics within the vehicle. I have neither, and I suspect that will change over time, and we will be given that option. Whereas Mike's going to talk about that. He's got the capability.
Absolutely. Well, thanks so much, Art. You're an inspiration to the community. Keep doing what you're doing. We'll hope to stay connected with you here at SmartNet Alliance. And yeah, really appreciate your presentation. And I'm sure all your neighbors are hopefully buying you a beer, or maybe coming over with a steak, or hopefully they're mowing your lawn and doing all that, right? So hopefully you should have a pretty easy going summer. Thanks again, Art.
Okay.
All right. Well, reminder, we have Mike Banks coming up a little bit later. David Long was supposed to join us. Unfortunately, he was pulled away for family matters. Now, he was able to do a video for us. So we've got a bit of a video on his system. He's an IT expert and won a scholarship from Carleton University for computer science back in 1990. He graduated in computer mathematics and he founded Sage T Software in 2012. And he's co-authored several Canadian and U.S. patents. So he recorded this for us earlier this week. It's a rundown of the system he ran. Pretty basic system. Unfortunately, we won't be able to do questions, but if anybody does want to reach out to him, I do have his contact. And let me fire that up, and then we'll roll over to Mike afterwards. So thanks, everybody.
Good day, everyone. My name is David Long, CEO of Xphone Mobile, and I'm going to tell you my story of how I got through with my family during the windstorm and how I went off-grid for 8 days and the system that I built. Okay, so we'll start off with the objective. So when the wind came through and knocked down pretty much all the trees in Ottawa, everyone was without power, and us included. So my immediate goal was just keep the basics running. So fridge, internet, basic appliances, and basically had to get this thing off the ground within minutes. Okay, so this was the problem. Basically, no power anywhere, more than your usual power outage where the lights are out for 15 minutes or 20 minutes. This was looking like it was going to be really a bad one. Okay, so the solution. Now, a lot of this stuff I already had. I've been, a supporter of going green for like ever, and I've had sort of an at-home solar project on the go for a long time, but I never actually finished it. So pretty much as soon as the lights went out, I just knew that I had to get this thing up and running. So at the time, I just had these two 25-watt monocrystalline panels that I bought as part of a kit. They're good in the sense that they can pick up light and turn it into electricity even if there's low light. And I picked up this other 100-watt panel at Canadian Tire partway through the week. And so that gave me 150 watts. Not a lot, but we managed to make it work. Okay, so for the equipment, I bought a new 1500-watt pure sine inverter. If you're going to do this, you definitely want a pure sine inverter. So it's like a real sine wave like you would get if you plugged into your AC outlet in your house. If you have a cheap inverter, it uses a square wave, and this can be very hard on electronics, and it'll work, but you don't want to plug your laptop computer or things like that into an inverter that has a square wave. You want a pure sine. Costs a few more bucks, but won't blow all of your expensive electronics when you try and use it. Surge to 3000 watts. So if you wanted to run something big for a short period of time, you could do it with one of these things. Okay, so a great feature of this inverter, it has a very, very long cable. It's a network cable. You can go any length, and a nice little remote. So I actually have this wired up in a breezeway in my house. So if you want to turn the inverter on and off, you can do it without having to go outside. And we can see we're running at 12.45 volts. Anything over 12 basically means it's charging. And you see this number go up and down through the day. It has 115 volts output, which is basically the same as you get from your power sockets in your house. And that's all good. And the average draw for the system was only about 100 watts. And I had 2 fridges plugged in and the internet, and we could charge some USB devices, and we had lights. And it was very dark because there were no lights anywhere in our neighborhood. So you wanted to get some kind of lighting because it was just pitch black. It's amazing how dark it is without even the street lights around. But the system, when it's sort of idling, was basically just 100 watts. I was surprised. I thought it would be more. And I figure it's because the compressors on the fridge, they only really draw power when they're running. So if the fridge is just sitting there, it's not actually using a lot of power. So you would see this go up if the fridge compressor turned on, but that's what we could get away with. So that was the draw, and it did succeed in making at least the internet working. We were with Bell, and you know, we were able to get the internet going. Big sigh of relief for my kids, because if they could surf on the internet, well, you know, they could function, right? That's sort of my comment on teenagers these days in the middle of a public disaster. As long as they can surf on the internet, we're good to go. Mom and dad will take care of the food. Okay, so now I immediately, when I went out and saw all the damage, I went straight to Walmart, and I bought one of these generators, which I had actually wanted to get one for a long time. And I saw a guy, he was carrying out one of these things as I was walking in, big lad. And I thought, oh, that could be the last one. So, you know, I was like Mario Andretti with my shopping cart getting over to the automotive section in Walmart, and there was one left. I think I put my back out a bit as I picked up this thing. It weighs, well, I had to lean over the shopping cart. I think that's where I injured myself, but it's about 100 pounds. No, not that much, maybe 80, but it's heavy. So good piece of kit. Brought it home. My wife and mom were looking at me like, you know, what is David doing? Is this another one of his like projects? Like, you know, we've got problems here. What's this thing with, and he's putting oil and gas in it, and like, this is one of his stupid projects. Anyway, I just put all that aside and gassed it up and ran it. And it's a really good generator. So this really was the backbone at the beginning. We didn't have the solar stuff that I showed you here until a few days later, but I got this thing off the ground, and you know, it'll run for about 8 to 10 hours. Definitely do not run this indoors or anywhere near indoors. I cheated a little bit. I had this at the edge of my shed just to keep the rain off. And I had some stovepipe there, so I was running the exhaust outside. That worked, but just be very careful with fumes on this one. It will kill you. Okay, so after that little advisory there, good little piece of kit. Recommend everybody get something like this or bigger. Okay, so the summary of the system, basically you have the solar system with, at the end of it, I had actually 3 batteries chained together in parallel. So that means red to red, black to black. And one thing that I always do when I'm working with 12 volt, one hand in the pocket, okay? Never use 2 hands, just use one, okay? And just do it like very carefully. You don't want to get a short circuit with 12 volts, especially if you're hooking them up in parallel. But basically you hook up the batteries to the inverter runs the house, and then you use the generator to charge the batteries. It outputs 8.5 amps, and it will charge it very nicely. And that way, because your generator will only run for about 8-10 hours. And it usually, if it's going to shut down because there's no gas, it'll be at 3 o'clock in the morning. So that's why you want to run off of the battery system, and you just have the generator backing it up. And if all hell breaks loose, just run the generator. So that's basically it. Overall, the system, so it's a gas electric system, 150 watts. And you could put one of these together with solar panels that you can get from Canadian Tire, generator from Walmart. Maybe about, if you had to buy the whole thing, maybe about $2,000. I've noticed that at least where I live, we have a power outage for about 3 days, about once a year. And we've had tornadoes in Ottawa. We had this windstorm this last year. I think it's a good investment because if you look at what life is like, okay, so just the final point about the generator. If you remember how much grief I got from my wife and my mom when I bought this thing in the beginning, by around day 3 or 4, with the generator running, both of them were like, David is like a Boy Scout. He is awesome. We are so glad that he is keeping the house running because we have electricity, and this is just great. So I went through unbelievable criticism to get the generator, but after 2 or 3 days, I was getting the nod from the lady folk. That was a very good decision. So highly recommend it. And if you are getting pushback at home, just barrel through that and get yourself one, because I think you're going to need something like this probably at least once a year, just based on what I see going on living here in Ottawa. Okay, so that's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much. Again, my name is David Long, CEO of Xphone Mobile.
All right. Well, thanks so much to David for recording that earlier this week. Definitely a great little system. If folks are looking to maybe invest a little bit more, maybe you want to get an electric vehicle that's going to do all that work that a generator with gas. Maybe you don't need that. So next up, we're happy to welcome in Mike Banks, who has a degree in public affairs and policy management, and he currently works as trade data analyst at Stats Canada. He's owned an electric vehicle since 2017, which he uses on his daily commute. Maybe not so daily anymore, right, Mike?
Nope.
And he's also retrofitting his house with clean technologies in the goal of making it net zero before 2030. He's active in helping people transition to zero-emission vehicles, having already converted most of his friends, family, and hopefully everyone here on Green Drinks too. As a board member and vice president of Electric Vehicle Council of Ottawa, he also helps coordinate and participates in the various public outreach events like the EV Experience and the Sustainability Showcase and EV Exhibition later this summer. So thanks for joining us, Mike. Excited to hear about your system. I know you're able to power your home and your in-laws, so you must have got some great brownie points there.
Oh, and neighbors too. Yeah, thanks, Nick. That was quite the intro. So I'm sharing now, and full screen should work. So if everything's good, then we're good. All right. So for those of you who aren't maybe from Ottawa or just want to see some pictures of damaged trees, this storm happened while I was working in the basement because I now work from home, so I no longer commute. And I looked outside and it was blue sky. And then I looked outside about 5 minutes later and it sounded like a train was going by and everything was blowing in the breeze. And then I get a message from my neighbor over the text saying my lilacs have come down on my deck. So I was like, uh-oh, that's not good. So these are my lilac trees on my deck. They fell over. And yeah, they're trees. I let them go wild. So it turns out lilac bushes turn into trees if you let them go for years. Anyway, this is the damage on my street. So one of my neighbors lost the top of a pine tree. It fell down in her yard. And one of the neighbors down on Alta Vista, a couple of houses got hit by very large trees that fell and crushed a Honda Civic. So this is the kind of damage that we were experiencing here in Ottawa. This tree is on the way to my parents' house. So my parents borrowed my chainsaw and they kept the chain oil. Like I got the chainsaw back, but they had the oil. So I thought, oh, I got a bunch of trees down, in my street. I'm gonna go to their house and pick up the chain oil so I can use my chainsaw. And as I round the corner on Featherston, I am confronted with this, right? And so I'm like, well, that's not good. And this is if you know Alta Vista at all, this is the worst possible location for this tree to come down because it blocks an entire block, and the way to go around it is like a kilometer of driving. So this tree had to be cut, and so I took out my chainsaw and we made a lane. And so we did this, and the neighbors were all like standing around being like, oh, we'll just wait for the city to come by. And I'm like, do you hear all those sirens everywhere? Yeah, the city people are busy. We're gonna have to do this ourselves. We're gonna have to self-rescue this time. And so be a bit resilient and, just take matters into your own hands. And so we cleared a lane. And anyway, I got to my parents' house and grabbed my chainsaw oil. Although it didn't help because my chain was dull by this point anyway, but whatever. The city itself, this is a pretty big blackout. This is the hydro map from a day later, so 24 hours after. This is what the outage map looked like. And their tweet with spelling errors and everything, this is what they just put out a day after. If you notice what they're talking about getting hospitals and the sewage treatment plant online. So when I saw this tweet, I thought, okay, so we're at the level of getting public services back up and running. We're nowhere near getting houses up and running, right? They're talking about making sure that the Robert Pickard environmental centered water treatment plant is back online. So that's like, this is level 1 stuff. And hospitals, right? They're getting hospitals back up. So it's going to be a while before they get to my neighborhood, given how much red is on the map here. So I have an electric car, which makes sense if I'm the vice president of EVCO. And you'll see the thing sticking out of the car. There's like a little white adapter sticking out of the charge port. And so that's a $300 adapter that Hyundai sells, as you know, if you can get it for your Ioniq 5 or EV6 or whatever. And so I picked this up about a week before the big storm hit. And my wife, of course, thought, you know, she's like, oh, she rolls her eyes. She's like, you spent $300 on that? You're an idiot. Right? I'm like, but it's for camping. Like, we're going to take it, you know, we'll go camping. We'll watch movies in the woods with a projector. We'll use the car as like a power source. It'll be cool. Plus, I can use it for astronomy. I can run my telescope off of it. And she's like, that's a waste of money. And then literally the next weekend, the storm hits and our fridges, you know, the power's out, right? And she's like, well, what are we going to do about the food in the fridge? Like, we have a lot of food in our fridges. And I'm like, well, we'll just use the adapter to run the fridges. So I plugged in my house. So that gave us lights. It gave us like a fridge and a freezer, put the Wi-Fi back online. So the kids stopped moaning about not having YouTube. You charged up, kept our iPads and everything up and running. And then later that day, my neighbor across the street saw this, bright yellow extension cord going up to my house. And he was walking out to his big Ram 1500 and he's like, that's a good idea. So he's walking out to his truck and I'm like, hey, what are you doing? And he's like, oh, I'm going to fire up the truck and do what you're doing and keep our fridges running because we got baby food and stuff. We don't want to, go bad and stuff. And I'm like, no. I don't want to hear your truck running for the next week. Just plug into my car. I've got an extra plug inside. It's like a 110 outlet. And so we ran an extension cord across the street and I kept his stuff running. And so basically the vehicle to load adapter, it gives you 1.5 kilowatts on the plug, which is what a standard household outlet will give you. It's 120 volts, 15 amps. It can surge up to 19 amps, but it's a sustained rate of 15 amps. The car just happened to have 64% charge when the storm hit. I don't charge it every day. It's it has a long range, so I charge it about once a week. So it just so happened that it was just over half full. It turns out that, as David was saying, a modern fridge uses about 100 watts, which is 0.1 kilowatts. So it turns out that's not a lot. The car's battery, when it's full, is 77.4 thousand kilowatt hours or watt hours, I should say. So it's 100 watts can go quite a while on that size pack. So I ended up running 2 fridges, lights, Wi-Fi, charging phones, whatever. And so we got power a week, 36 hours after the storm hit. But then my in-laws texted the morning we had power and they're like, can you come bring your car over? Our fridges are melting, right? They're thawing out. And so I ended up going to their house and plugged in all their stuff. And so they had 2 fridges, lights, Wi-Fi, and all the rest. And I left it there just in their driveway for a full week, just locked and off. And the adapter was in the car. And that full week of usage only used 10% of my battery. So I had, 55% charge, 54% charge by the end of the week there. And I could keep track of it on my phone. And the benefit, unlike David's little system, so I see David's generator and I raise him an EV. And that EV basically just sat there quietly, silently in the driveway with an extension cord running from it, powering all the stuff. And it didn't have to be, refilled. It didn't have to be tampered with. It could sit out in the rain. It was no problem. That plug is weather sealed. And the neighbors, my in-laws' neighbors, all have those little generators from Walmart or whatever, and they're all 1.5 kilowatts as well. But they have to get refilled every 8 to 10 hours, as David said. And so they would be, they're loud and they're noisy and they're smelly and they sit outside in the backyard. And so my father-in-law was going to go gardening, but he couldn't because 3 of the houses around him had these little generators running, and he was like, "That's the fumes back there." He was like, "Nah, I can't do it." But this car will happily do that nonstop, 24/7 for weeks, literally weeks. It lasted a week, but that's when their power came back on. But it could have gone, a month probably, and then recharge. And so that's the question though, right? How do you recharge the car if there's a blackout, right? Well, actually, I'll get to that in a second. There's one other thing. I did borrow the car from them during that week. So Sean Menard put out a tweet asking for help at a community housing building where they'd been without power for many days at this point. And a lot of people had no way of charging their phones. And you think like a phone is kind of a trivial thing for a lot of people, like it's just a phone. But what I discovered, just lending my car for the afternoon, letting them charge up off of it, which used like none of my battery, basically, like it didn't even register on the dash, was that these people, like these are their lifelines to family and loved ones. And like families had gone days without speaking to their family members. So they wanted to check in to make sure everyone was okay, right? And they hadn't had that option until their phones got charged. So I spent, several hours there charging up everyone's phones, and it was a nice day. The weather was good. So anyway, this is my father-in-law's house, and you can see the little picture there is the extension cord maze that rent to all the fridges. They had 2 fridges and a freezer and a bunch of lights and all the Wi-Fi and everything. And so that's what it was. It was just sitting there for a full week, doing its thing quietly, silently, no pollution in the driveway. So I think the next slide is about charging. So we have 2 EVs. Our first one, the one I bought 5 years ago, is the Nissan Leaf you see pictured here. And it turns out that some parts of Ottawa, as you saw on the map, weren't red. And one of those parts was the Electrify Canada charging station at Coventry at the Canadian Tire. And I knew this because on PlugShare, one of the apps that we use to charge our cars, or to like find chargers, basically, it's crowdsourced. And so people were reporting which ones were offline from the blackout and which ones were still available. And so I was able to take my Leaf, and that's what we were using to drive around and cut up trees and whatever. And I could fast charge it at the charger. It was like, 20 minutes or whatever. And then we'd be back to ready to go, full charge again, and off we go. And so had this blackout lasted longer, I would have just taken the other car here, charged it up in 15 minutes, and then I would have had 80% charge and gone another 8 weeks before needing to charge it up again, right? And the beautiful thing about the charging versus the gas stations, right? So this is something that a lot of people don't realize, right? Is that gas stations can't pump gas in a blackout either, right? So if there's a blackout and it hits a charger, obviously there's no power, right? But if there's a gas station and there's a blackout, there's no gas. The pumps need electricity to run, right? So what was happening is that all the gas stations that did have power had all the people, had all the demand, right? Everyone was going to the ones that had power, and there were apps that were telling people where those were. And so I had a friend who literally, he called me from the Costco out in Barhaven, waiting in line for 2 hours to buy gas. And he was bored. So he called me and he's just talking about, how he was doing. But he was in line for 2 hours waiting for his gas, right? And he wasn't sure that when he got to the pump, there would be enough gas for him to fill his car, right? Because the thing with a gas station is that the gas lives in the ground and it's a finite supply. Whereas I know, even if I had to wait in line at Electrify Canada, there would always be electricity. If there was power at that station, it doesn't run out of electricity, right? Electricity is not a physical good, if you will. So I could wait in line all day, and I knew that when it was my turn, I would be able to charge, right? And that's sort of one of the hidden beauties of having an EV. So anyway, that's how I charge the car. So what are the lessons here? Well, the first lesson is that, yes, my wife agrees now I am a genius. I bought a $300 dongle for my car and was able to power our house and then her parents' house for a full week, and saved all our food, and I made our kids happy because we had Wi-Fi and the internet. But that living sustainably isn't really a hippie thing anymore, right? These storms are very common. These things are going to get worse. They're going to get more frequent. So this is more of a survival thing at this point, right? It's a night. I thought I bought it on a lark, thinking, yeah, $300 isn't too bad. It'll run my astronomy and whatever. But it turns out that this thing actually served a much more important purpose, right? And it sort of shows you a path to the things to come, right? Where you have these vehicles now that have massive battery packs in your driveway, right? If you buy an EV, you have this ability, or you will if you buy one, that you can use, that you can tap into in an emergency and power critical things. And a lot of EVs are now going to start supporting vehicle to load. Some of them, like the F-150, actually support like full home backup, where you can use the battery pack to run your entire house, like air conditioning and everything. And so like that's a functionality that gas cars can't match. And that's another killer app for an EV. And so if you're interested in looking at electric cars, I actually added a column to our sort of famous buyer's guide now. So The last column I added is vehicle to load, or AC power generator capability. I didn't know what to call it. Every brand has their own marketing term, so I just sort of gave it a generic name. And you'll see that a lot of cars don't have the functionality yet, but it's coming, right? So a lot of the new, like the new Nero that's coming out this year, the 2023, it now will support vehicle to load. So that list is going to start changing. And that might be a factor for your next purchasing decision. So this is the EVCO buyer's guide. I try and keep this as up to date as possible. I haven't really looked at it in a month, but I'll get there. It's on our website. If you just go to evco.ca, you can click on buyer's guide. It's right at the top, and it'll take you to a spreadsheet. It is a Google Sheet, so you can just download it and filter it however you like. It's just a normal spreadsheet, and so you can sort by price or range or whatever it is you want. And it's got a little picture of each car, so you sort of have an idea of what the car actually looks like, and it gives you can compare like for like and see which cars are better and whatnot, and it's kind of cool. But now it also has vehicle to load as one of the filtering options, so you can check that out as well. And I had a really short presentation, at least it felt short to me, so I'm open for questions now, and I will stop sharing my screen.
Thanks, Mike. I'm definitely noticing a trend of wives who are maybe skeptical at first and then fully on board after, right? So
Right,
that's great, or partners or sort of thing, right?
Yeah,
so
yeah.
so that's great. I shared a link to the buyer's guide there. Just
Awesome.
going through it quickly. Looks like the Ioniq 5 is good to go. Looks like the Kias that you mentioned, the Ford F-150.
Yep.
So invite people to kind of roll through that. GM Hummer, if anybody's interested in that. Chevrolet Silverado, that's interesting. So yeah, that's a fun one, and definitely something to think about as well. A couple questions, and invite people to add them if they come up. Dan was just wondering, grab the questions here. What did you use to disconnect from the grid during the power outage when your EV was plugged in? Is that something you had to worry about?
No, so like when the grid goes down, the EV just stops charging on the house, right? So I just unplugged it from the charger, and then I just left the house alone. And the way I powered the fridges, I just unplugged them from the wall and put them into a power bar, right? Like it was a quick and dirty emergency type of deal, where I just ran an extension cord up through a window, and then power bars and extension cords all over to keep things running. So it was quick and dirty, but it worked.
Brent's wondering, who is Imperium? Is this a Chinese company? And
Yes.
who sells them in Canada?
Imperium will sell them in Canada. I think starting this fall is what their plan is. I don't know if that's shifted at all, but yeah, they're a Chinese company. They're brand new, and they've shown up at a couple of auto shows now. So hopefully they're good. I know some people have pre-ordered them, so that's cool.
I think Raymond wanted to jump in with some comments over there. Raymond, President, Electric Vehicle Council. Come on in.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. I just wanted to mention that the Ford F-150, there's a device you could purchase for it that essentially integrates the Ford F-150 Lightning with your house system.
Yeah.
So it has a switch to isolate it from the grid, and it's got all the electronics required to convert the DC power in the battery back into AC and all that.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh, and what I should say is the way that this works is when you charge an EV, right? That we call them chargers on the wall, right? Like the thing that you plug into, but that's not actually a charger. That's just what we call them for simplicity's sake. The actual charger for an EV is actually inside each car, right? It's an inverter. And so what you're doing is you're plugging in AC, alternating current, into the car, and then the car is converting it to DC on board and charging the battery pack, right? And so what Hyundai and Kia have basically done is they've just made the inverter two-way, right? So for most EVs right now, like Teslas, they only go one way. You AC in, DC to the pack, right? So what Hyundai Kia have done in my car and others is they basically just run that inverter backwards and provide AC out as well. So it's the same.
Could you see an aftermarket hack to be able to make those ones with the one way?
Yeah, obviously, I don't know. So somebody
warranty, but
somebody asked me a direct message here about a legal way to get power out of a Tesla. No, not that I know of. It voids the warranty as far as I can tell.
Yes,
so not a good idea if you have a Tesla, but they may support it in the future because honestly, the hardware is already in the cars, right? It's just I don't know if it would require any physical changes, but certainly a software change would be needed. But the inverter is already on board all the EVs. It's just a matter of being able to run it backwards.
Rosalind's
Uh,
wondering what's the rationale for Tesla? Was it just too new, or
I think they just want to sell power walls.
right?
Well, there's also the requirement that the local utility must approve it.
Yeah.
And in this case, the local utility is being controlled by the IESO, which is being controlled by Ford, the Ford government, who don't believe in climate change and all this nonsense.
Well, I mean, there's no reason why Tesla couldn't enable what Hyundai has done, where they just let the inverter run backwards and you can run, a wall outlet from the car, right? There's no reason why Tesla doesn't allow that, other than they just want to sell power battery packs. I don't know. Like it's hard to say.
Yeah, so Sandy Monroe actually answered that question in one of the videos he did about when he tore down, I think it was a Model 3, and he said that there was a bit of circuitry missing to complete that, but there wasn't much. So it seems it wouldn't be a very big stretch for Tesla to support that. But Tesla has other ideas in terms of not just power walls, but also supplying batteries for the grid, right?
Yeah.
And if EVs were to play that role, then it would sort of
eat that market.
Yeah. So it's not clear that Tesla is very much in favor of supporting vehicle to grid.
And Rick points out in the chat, and he's correct. The inverter is DC to AC, and a rectifier is AC to DC. So, yeah, I stand corrected, but it's the same, basic thing, just a different direction.
So, Mike, final question for you. I know you're looking at going solar, going net zero. Have you thought about how you would be able to power your electric vehicle if the grid went down?
Oh, yeah.
You had a solar setup? What would that look like? Would you?
So Art will be proud of me right now. So I just put in an air source heat pump on my house. So I've now electrified my heating for the house. So the only two gas things left are my water tank and my stove. And those are relatively trivial to swap out for electric. And then my plan is this: once I am fully electric in my house, I will live a year to see what my usage actually is, my consumption in a full year. And then I will size a solar array on the roof and some sort of battery and islanding ability to isolate from the grid if I need to. And that way I can size things exactly as I need for my house. That's the plan.
Assume that you'd have to just use a level 1 charger at that point, right? It'd be pretty hard to plug in your level 2 or 3, right?
Level 2, I could probably do. It depends on the demand and what's possible with solar, like how much roof I have. I mean, my house faces due south, so it is kind of perfect for solar. So I just have to figure out some math once I've electrified everything.
Yeah, so just a clarification there, Nick. You would never have level 3 at home.
Yeah, you wouldn't have that.
Right? Level 3 requires an input of 400 or 800 volt, which is typically not available in residential electrical grids.
Not yet, at least, but sounds like we'll have to have Mike back in a couple of years once he gets his system set up. Maybe even a couple of months for next year's storm, right?
No. That's a lot of money.
Well, all those big bucks you make being vice president of the EVCO will hopefully all those
nonprofit, exactly.
Right? Yeah. Right on. Well, thanks so much, Mike. Thanks so much to Art and to David as well. Great to know that there's some homeowners out there really leading the way, blazing the trails, setting an amazing example of what we can do on a local level for grid independence. I want to bring in our next speaker now to give us a little bit more of a 30,000-foot perspective on grid independence and what's out there. We're delighted to welcome Dr. Alexandra Mallet, whose experience spans academia and the public sectors. She's worked on the design, implementation, and evaluation of energy, climate change, and environmental policy. She's worked for Natural Resources Canada, Environment Canada, and academic institutions like Carleton University, the University of Sussex in the UK, and the University of Minnesota. Her research areas include an examination of innovation, cooperation, and adoption processes involved in sustainable energy technologies, especially in emerging technologies. So welcome in, Alexandra. Thanks so much for joining us. Excited to hear a bit more from you.
Thank you. Now, first of all, can I just confirm that you see my slides?
Yeah, coming through clear, and we can see and hear you. So everything's all good.
Okay, cool. So a little bit of an overview. I'm going to just mention very briefly a little bit about me so you know who you're talking to. Then I'm going to focus on the context. As Nick says, we'll be moving more away from the local level to more of a bird's eye view. That being said, I will speak a little bit about my experience. I was chuckling about the comments because I have 2 school-age kids, and they were actually at my in-laws, so I didn't have to worry so much about entertaining them. Then I'm going to talk about what's the problem and what to do. Where do we go from here? Sorry, where do we go from here? All right, so first of all, very nice to meet you. I also want to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you today where I live and work on the traditional territory of the Algonquin peoples here in Ottawa. That being said, I was born in Halifax and I was raised in a very small town in Northern Ontario called New Liskeard. I mention that because by virtue of having that childhood, I spent a lot of time outside. And I say this because I think it's one reason why I've always been passionate and interested in environmental issues. For instance, I was part of the Earth Club back in the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s when
Oh, I think we just lost your sound.
Can you hear me? Hello?
Now you're coming through, yeah.
Weird. Okay. All right, I'll
We
keep
had a little
going.
grid outage, maybe. Wasn't
Yeah.
it doing that?
Okay. A little bit about me, again, associate professor. One thing to know, Carleton's also had a Master of Arts program in sustainable energy policy since 2010. And before joining academia, I worked for the federal government, and I used to work actually on the climate change negotiations and environmental policy. Having said that, as you can see, like all yourselves, I'm certainly passionate about climate, energy, environmental issues, but I'm also a mom with 2 school-age kids and married, and yes, with a skeptical husband, an engineer with an MBA. This is just a little bit about me. I'm a social scientist, so trained mainly in political science, some economics, history, etc. And my PhD research looked at Brazil and looking at solar water heaters, but I've also been working with some Indigenous communities in Northwest Territories. If you look here on the right, that's in Colville Lake, a community north of the Arctic Circle. And for them, actually, they have the first solar diesel battery system in the north, and they've had it running since 2016. And I've also looked at how smart grids framing has been in the media. As you can see there, basically the topic of conversation was about smart meters. In addition, I teach in the School of Public Policy, so a lot of the courses that I teach are to do with policy. When does a problem warrant the attention of governments? Once governments decided what to do, what's the criteria? What are some relevant policy tools? How do we implement it, etc. All right. And I mentioned the master's program already. So we're here to talk about, lessons from the storms. First of all, I think it's important to understand we've been here before. So we saw the slides earlier in terms of all the outages. Well, this has happened again. And I'm like, how come my house is always in the middle of those red spots? And this was the Ottawa tornadoes. Again, we also have had the Ottawa Gatineau floods. Again, the 100-year event that's happened over the span of 2 years. And as everybody has been saying, it's not like these events are going away. They're happening more and more. And then we talk about the 2022 derecho. And this picture was actually taken at my house. So where was I? I was actually home alone with my dog. My husband took the kids to go see his parents. And I thought, oh, great, I'll have a relaxing time at home. Well, no, these pictures were basically taken back to back. And as you can see, just the intensity of the storm and how quickly it happened. That being said, again, a policy window or even a window at a personal level, this is where I said, okay, I've been trying to convince my husband that we really need solar panels. And he says, our house doesn't face south. We have oodles of trees. No, doesn't make sense. But we did actually, after this event, I decided, okay, you know what? I'm tired of hearing all these loud, noisy, smelly fumes generators. So I actually went out, the little one over here on the left, it's just 10 watts. Hey, help me with my phone. Absolutely great. But then we decided, okay, let's buy a battery and solar system. And so the battery's 1,800 watts. And the solar panels there's 2 of them and 160 watts. So again, options, because I couldn't in all good conscience buy a gas generator. On the other hand, I wanted some power. So what's the problem here? Well, the problem is that our electricity grid is an old system for a new world. As Art and others have said, okay, look, at the end of the day, we really need to start electrifying things and electrifying things using clean power. If you look at over here, I mean, the way if you conventionally think about electricity, it flows one way. It was designed, again, big, nuclear generators, etc. Now let's fast forward to 2022, where people want to have more local ways of generating electricity. And as your other 3 guests have pointed to. So the concern, the utilities say, and as Art points out, political interests are also at play, but the concern is that the utilities say, oh, well, this will cause a utility death spiral, right? So the more we get people like Art and Dave and Mike and Alex and others that cut the cord, kind of like cable television, then what's going to happen is there's other people who can't do that, like rural or lower income. And so the prices of electricity will keep increasing. And at the end of the day, more and more people will be pulled away. That being said, there are growing calls for action. I'm thinking of Angela's comments earlier, right? When she was talking about the climate marches or, conversations I have with my kids. And basically they say, all right, this is a climate crisis. We need change now. You may have seen recently, this was pulled from earlier in terms of the Liberal, NDP and Greens call for zero carbon national electricity grid. And that has actually recently come up. And so the idea is basically, if you think of how our electricity systems have evolved in Canada, the lines are mainly north to south. Well, the idea here is actually, all right, well, maybe we need to move more east to west. I'm actually a firm believer, perhaps like all of Art, Dave, and Mike, that I think we need to go more decentralized. All right, and now before you think, oh, well, maybe this is only young people who galvanize and get on the streets, etc. This survey was actually done. I live in Bay Ward. A lot of people live in Bay Wards are, it's a bit older. A lot of healthcare workers live here. And as you can see here in my ward, 93% of residents are very concerned about climate change. Now, the question becomes, all right, the governments are doing some things. I want to be clear that it's not like they're doing nothing. That being said, are these actions enough, right? Well, so what do we do? Okay, well, number one, we have to invest in smart grids. All the various technologies that you've been talking about and your experiences and what have you, things are happening. So how do we actually encourage more of this innovation, right? And so the question becomes, all right, well, we have to make our grids more intelligent. So again, as Art was telling us, we have microgrids. And as Mike was doing with respect to, his car, right? And so the question becomes, all right, so what's the key ingredient? It's the whole notion of connectivity and information technology. And so as Art was saying, I was reminded of his point about the control system. But it's also not to do only with, oh, let's pump out more electrons, just make sure they're clean. It's also to do with demand side management. So that's things like, all right, well, let's get a better understanding of how much energy and water we're using. Can we optimize it a little bit more? Can we use our resources more, et cetera? And as well as, things like climate change resiliency and so on, as well as you may be familiar with the term circularity. So why are we interested in this? Well, as we've all seen, there's more awareness of low probability, high impact events. Now, I'm thinking of the conversations you've all had with your family and friends. And so again, yes, similar thing, my sisters, my husband, they all think I'm a little bit, but lo and behold, when we look at what's happened, well, actually, this is coming more dinner table conversation. I've also mentioned I have been working with some Indigenous communities, and for them, actually, they are really interested in local grid decentralized options due to more independence. For a number of them, they see it as a way to pull away from the settler governments and a way to be masters of their own community development. So what to do? Well, also reform public policy, right? And so again, people are looking into this issue. As you can see here, this study was done in terms of, can we adapt Canada's current utility regulation landscape? A number of issues that came up in the chat were to do with, all right, well, what are the relevant codes? Well, if we want to do this, we have to check in with our local distribution company. And so basically, public policy needs to catch up to where the technology is. And finally, my final point I want to make is that we need to reevaluate how we assess risk, climate risk, for instance. So I'll give you an example. So basically, as I understand it, I read this in the CBC News, where Stantec actually did conduct a study looking at climate risk and vulnerability, and high catastrophic winds were identified as a key area of risk. Well, okay, good grief. Why isn't this mandatory for all utilities? And not only making the risk identification of risks mandatory, but why aren't plans in terms of how to mitigate or what to do if this happens mandatory? And as you can see here, there actually are more interactive platforms where basically, as you can see, the Climate Atlas of Canada, it gives an interactive peek in terms of what might happen in the future. And with that, I will stop with 4 minutes to go.
Yeah, thanks so much, Alexandra. Great presentation. Nice to hear about some of the important work that you're up to, and yeah, really nice to hear some of those Indigenous communities kind of coming on board there as well. Yeah, well, anybody's got any questions, they can add them into chat. I'm just wondering, for the folks that maybe don't have a lot to spend, is there sort of behavioral fixes? I know, like riding your bike to work or taking the air conditioning down when you don't need it. That's one of my pet peeves. It's 10 degrees and the neighbors are still running the air conditioning. Like, just open your windows, people, right? Are there some behavioral changes that folks should look at as well, or is most of your work kind of on that bird's eye view?
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. So to your point about behaviors, there is a tension often in, energy transition circles on whether or not we should go the technology route or the behavior route. A lot of people say, well, you need to do both, right? One reason why, say, policymakers are a bit, what am I trying to say here? They're a bit less reluctant to go the behavior route because of the unpredictability. So for instance, if you can get people to change their behavior and, just as you say, knock it down a nudge or what have you, or just be a little bit more uncomfortable and so on. But from a utilities perspective, when you aggregate all of those little intricate differences, it becomes harder to control. Having said that, studies have shown with respect to buildings, there is a distinct difference between the amount of power used, or I'm sorry, not power, Art's point is important about heating and cooling, energy usage in buildings, that exact same building, similar, housing model or office building, et cetera. And the energy uses can be really, really different. And so the question becomes, what explains the change? Behavior. So in that vein, you're right. Yes, there are moves towards behavior. And so, a number of economists have looked at price signals. And so the extent to which price signals play a role with respect to electricity usage. And the evidence is mixed. In some instances, I think there was a study in Connecticut where it said, yes, absolutely, that this makes a difference. Whereas, in other jurisdictions, maybe not as much. In Ontario, I seem to recall, and anyone can correct me if I'm wrong, that the estimated reductions in energy use was actually overestimated. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Rosalind's wondering, what is the appetite of our regulator to decentralize the grid? Is that something you've looked at in your work?
Yeah. So, and again, as Art was noting, the ISO, and I think if I can go back to my slide, whoops, I'm not going to screw it up. Anyway, they are looking into this issue. So they have a DER working group, so distributed energy sources working group. And basically, to answer your question, yes, they're interested. And there are some projects. In addition, I think I was reading Hydro Ottawa has one in Canada where they're actually looking at the fluctuation of voltage and what have you. So looking at really creative ways to try and reduce demand, et cetera. So I think that there is an undercurrent that might be interested in this. However, there is the powers that be that also, you know, if you spend $12 billion in refurbishing, you know, one of the nuclear power plants, then that sends a strong signal that people are still really interested in centralization. Having said that, to be honest, the fact that the ISO is even commissioning these studies and looking at it as a potentiality, I think, you know, shows that the government is at least interested in looking at this issue.
That's great. And does your work cover like incentives and rebates and things like that in all this? Is that something that, you know, is encouraged? Is it a bit of a crutch that we shouldn't rely on? I know we've got the Greener Homes grant. You know, we've got some other incentives out there. Do we think that we could kind of incentivize our way out of this, or is that sort of a political hot potato that could get dropped?
Yeah. So I mean, I think if we're really serious about it, we need to, right? And so this is where I go back to, you know, my husband, the voice of, I was going to say reason, but no. He tells me, he says, Alex, you know, you're like the 20% of people, but you know, you have to think about the 80% of people. And so those incentives may actually get you to move the needle in, you know, towards a direction where you're actually getting more of the population into this direction. Having said that, some of the criticisms I've heard about the Green Homes program is, number one, it favors homeowners. And so you're leaving out a large segment of Canada's population. And number two, it tends to be favored more towards detached houses, right? Rather than, you know, people who who live in MURBs, multi-unit residential buildings, for instance. Having said that, you know, you got to start somewhere. And I know that the government is actually starting to say, okay, if we really want to bring everyone forward, and we need to acknowledge this. And so they're starting to look at some lower income programs, because it goes back to your point about behavior. And so, for instance, if you're a tenant, there's the whole split incentives problem, right? And so on the one hand, if you don't own the building and you just pay a flat fee every month, well, what's the incentive for you, you know, to turn down the thermostat? On the other hand, you know, from the landlord or landlady's perspective, they say, all right, well, if, you know, I'm not going to be in this building and it's just going to be tenant after tenant, what incentive do I have to invest in building a more, you know, efficient apartment?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm wondering about the folks who sort of want to come on board and embrace these renewable technologies, but they simply can't. They live in a MURB and they can't have an EV. They live in downtown Ottawa and they can't put solar into the grid. What do we do with those folks? Or, you know, do we ask those folks to move? Do we figure out how we can, you know, change the system? Do we have to have government pushing folks along? How do we, you know, there seems to be a pile of folks that want to make this move that really simply can't. Any thoughts there?
Yeah, I mean, I think you raise a really valid point. I guess a couple of things there. So yes, I think we definitely need incentives, and we need to make sure that, you know, any policies or legislation are inclusive, right, and equitable. And so if we're really serious about this, then I think we need to, you know, adapt the policies, change the system. I'm not saying, you know, everyone needs to, you know, start the revolution. I remember Adrian was saying that the energy independence revolution. On the other hand, you know, look at what we can do, right? Look at what the changes that are happening. And so, you know, by virtue of starting somewhere and saying, you know what, this is not right, you can talk to your city councilors, you can, you know, talk to the government and make things happen.
Absolutely. No, some great points there, Alexandra. I want to thank you again for a great presentation. Yeah, I really appreciate you coming on. I want to thank all the speakers. Like I mentioned at the beginning, I think if there's one silver lining we can kind of get out of this, it's that folks are talking about it more. It's more in the vernacular now. People are thinking about it when they're buying homes and cars. And so, obviously we don't want to have 10 or 11 fatalities like we did to be able to spur that, and the tens of thousands of trees that went down. But if we can find a silver lining, it's that folks are talking, thinking, and hopefully acting a little bit more around renewable technologies since this storm, right? So let's hope that it is a little bit of a spur towards people who, hey, now it's my time to get off the grid, or it's my time to get an electric vehicle and get out there and make those moves and get that action rolling. So once again, I want to thank everybody. Thanks so much to Art, an amazing microgrid home. I'm sure he'll be opening up for tours as soon as we're fully through the pandemic, and we'll stay in touch with him. Thanks so much again to David. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to join us, but really appreciate him putting that video together. I want to thank Mike and Raymond as well, but Mike for that great presentation. And I'm sure you've got brownie points with the in-laws for at least 10 or 20 years now, right? You'll be going over for Sunday dinners. I want to thank everybody in chat, Raymond and Angela. Really appreciate your comments, and Rosalind and Richard and a lot of folks who were asking some great questions, David as well. Really appreciate everybody. Want to invite everybody to join us for our next Green Drinks in 4 weeks' time, August 11th. I'll put that into chat now so everybody can get signed up. And that one, we're going to talk about sustainable housing. So another great hot topic, so to speak. And we'll be hearing about some great models around sustainable housing. So once again, thanks everybody for coming out. Really appreciate it. And, some great knowledge there. Hopefully everybody's excited. Hopefully everybody's going to go out and hey, maybe I should go solar, or maybe I should get that electric vehicle and that kind of thing. So we hope we're encouraging people and giving people some great real world advice and knowledge. Thanks again, everybody. Hopefully folks can join us in August. Once again, I'm Nick at SmartNet Alliance. Thanks again for joining us on Virtual Green Drinks. Have a great night.
Thank you.
Night, everybody.
Good night.
Thank